How did a collection of salt-sprayed rocks and lawless lagoons become the cornerstone of the modern global financial elite? It is the ultimate paradox of capital. The very men who sought to destroy the empires of the 17th century inadvertently built the scaffolding for the greatest tax shelters in human history. We imagine pirates as chaotic agents of destruction, yet they were the first true venture capitalists of the Atlantic, operating outside the reach of sovereign debt and royal decree. While the crowns of Europe bled their citizens dry to fund endless wars, the Caribbean was quietly evolving into a zone of pure, untaxed liquidity. This wasn't just a rebellion against the king. It was the birth of a shadow economy that never truly went away. The Caribbean in the late 1600s was a vacuum of power and a surplus of opportunity. In Port Royal, Jamaica, the air was thick with the scent of stolen spices and Spanish gold, creating a marketplace where the only law was the contract between captain and crew. These pirate codes were the first articles of incorporation in the New World, establishing a primitive form of social insurance and profit sharing that bypassed the heavy-handed monopolies of the East India companies. While London and Madrid strangled trade with tariffs and bureaucracy, the Brethren of the Coast practiced a brutal, efficient form of free market capitalism. They realized that wealth was not merely about the hoard, but about the ability to move it where the state could not see it. Nassau became a clearinghouse for hot capital, where plundered goods were laundered into legitimate currency through corrupt colonial governors. This created a feedback loop of bribery and reinvestment that turned a nest of thieves into a sophisticated financial hub. The governors realized they could grow their local economies faster by ignoring the source of the wealth than by enforcing the king's law. This systemic corruption was the prototype for the modern offshore jurisdiction. By providing a flag of convenience and a sanctuary from seizure, these islands proved that capital would always flow toward the path of least resistance. The pirate bank was not a physical building with marble pillars. It was a conceptual breakthrough in the decoupling of wealth from the nation-state. It was here that the world learned that if you provide a place where the law does not reach, the money will find its way to your shores. By the turn of the century, the scale of this underground economy had reached a fever pitch, threatening the very stability of the mercantilist system. The pirate bank had become too successful, forcing the empires to choose between total war or assimilation. As the rope began to tighten around the necks of the most famous outlaws, the smarter players began to pivot. They realized that you didn't need a black flag to hide money. You just needed a different kind of ledger. The transition from the cutlass to the contract was beginning, and the Caribbean's role as the world's secret vault was only just getting started. The myth of the buried chest of gold is a romantic lie. The reality was far more sophisticated and far more dangerous to the status quo. If a pirate buried his treasure, he was failing as an economist, for stagnant capital serves no one. Instead, the most successful captains sought regulatory capture before the term even existed. They found willing partners in colonial administrators who were underpaid by the crown and hungry for a piece of the maritime plunder. This unholy alliance between the outlaw and the official transformed the Caribbean from a war zone into a sophisticated money laundering machine. Governors like Thomas Modiford and Benjamin Fletcher didn't just tolerate piracy, they integrated it into the local GDP. By issuing letters of marque that were little more than licenses to steal, they gave the pirates a thin veneer of legality. In exchange, the pirates brought high-velocity capital into starving colonial outposts. When a ship arrived in Port Royal laden with silver, that silver didn't just sit in a cellar. It paid for infrastructure, imported luxury goods, and filled the pockets of the merchant class. This created a vested interest in maintaining the Caribbean as a gray zone, where the strictures of London's financial laws were selectively ignored. The complexity of these transactions required a primitive form of accounting that prioritized secrecy over transparency. Merchants would buy plundered goods at a fraction of their value and resell them through legitimate channels, effectively cleaning the money. This process proved that the origin of wealth could be obscured through a series of rapid, high-volume trades, a technique still used by modern tax havens today. The pirate bank was expanding its services from mere storage to complex brokerage, proving that as long as there was a middleman willing to look the other way, no treasure was too dirty to be spent. However, This prosperity was built on a knife's edge of political shifting sands. As the British Navy grew in strength, the cost of protection for these governors began to outweigh the benefits of the pirate trade. The empires realized that while piracy boosted local colonial economies, it was draining the central imperial treasury. A tension began to rise between the periphery and the core, a classic economic conflict that would eventually lead to the Golden Age being violently dismantled. Even as the gallows were being built, the financial infrastructure, the networks of offshore agents and secret accounts, remained intact. The pirate had taught the merchant that the sea was not just a highway, but a shield. As the 18th century matured, the British Empire underwent a radical shift in its economic philosophy. The loose-handed era of colonial neglect was over, replaced by a rigid mercantilism that viewed every ounce of pirate silver as a direct theft from the royal mint. This was the first great crackdown on offshore finance. The Crown realized that for the Bank of England to maintain its hegemony, the pirate bank had to be liquidated. This wasn't just a moral crusade against theft. It was a desperate attempt to regain control over the global money supply. The Caribbean was no longer a playground for the bold. It was a battlefield for the soul of capitalism. Naval blockades and hanging judges like Woodes Rogers were dispatched to the West Indies, not to bring peace, but to bring order to the markets. Rogers, a former privateer himself, understood the economics of the pirate trade better than anyone. He offered the king's pardon to those who would surrender their hoards and join the legitimate economy, while promising the noose to those who remained in the shadows. This created a massive capital flight. The pirates who accepted the pardon didn't just disappear. They became the new merchant class of the islands, using their ill-gotten gains to buy plantations and respectability. The transition was brutal. The free trade zones of Nassau and Port Royal were forcibly integrated into the imperial system, subject to the Navigation Acts and crushing taxes. However, the DNA of the pirate economy proved impossible to erase. While the outward signs of piracy, the Jolly Roger and the broadsides, faded, the underlying expertise in evading authority simply went deeper underground. The brokers who had once helped pirates sell stolen cocoa and silk now helped plantation owners smuggle goods to avoid British duties. The method had changed, but the objective remained the same: the preservation of profit against the encroachment of the state. This era taught the world a vital lesson in financial history. You can destroy the agent, but you cannot destroy the incentive. As long as the tax burden in London remained high, the desire for a Caribbean loophole would persist. The mercantilist siege succeeded in ending the golden age of piracy, but it failed to close the vault. It merely taught the offshore world how to be more discreet. The pirates had been replaced by smugglers, and the smugglers would eventually be replaced by lawyers. The stage was being set for a new kind of maritime power, one that didn't need a single cannon to defy an empire. By the mid-1700s, the Caribbean had entered a new phase of economic evolution. The pirate bank had shed its violent exterior and donned the wig of the colonial merchant. Piracy had become too high risk, but smuggling was a professional endeavor. The islands became a giant transshipment point for contraband wealth. This was the era of the interloper, the small-time trader who specialized in navigating the complex web of European trade restrictions. These men were the direct descendants of the pirates, utilizing the same secret coves and corrupt connections to move wealth through the cracks of the imperial system. The Caribbean became a giant washing machine for the global economy. Spanish silver, French molasses, and British manufactured goods flowed through neutral ports like St. Eustatius. This tiny Dutch island became the busiest port in the world, a free port that belonged to no single empire but served them all. It was the ultimate middleman, a jurisdiction that offered no questions and low fees. Here, the legacy of the pirate bank reached its first peak of efficiency. It was a place where the source of wealth was irrelevant, provided the transaction was completed. The economic impact of this smuggling was staggering. It is estimated that nearly half of all trade in the 18th century Caribbean was technically illegal. This massive gray market provided the liquidity that fueled the growth of the American colonies and kept the sugar islands from bankruptcy. The smuggler's pivot proved that the offshore model was not a fluke of history, but a fundamental necessity for a globalizing world. The empires needed these zones of legal ambiguity just as much as the outlaws did, for they provided the vent through which the pressures of mercantilism could be released. Yet, this reliance on the gray market created a permanent culture of secrecy. The Caribbean islands learned that their greatest asset was not their soil, but their ability to look the other way. This cultural trait became embedded in the local legal systems, creating a tradition of bank secrecy and client anonymity that would survive long after the empires crumbled. The transition from pirate to smuggler was complete, and the transition from smuggler to financier was just a matter of time. The tension was rising as the Caribbean prepared to face the ultimate test, the birth of the modern nation-state. As the 19th century dawned, the Caribbean's role as a financial sanctuary became inextricably linked with the darkest chapter of human history, the Atlantic slave trade and the plantation economy. The pirate bank had evolved into a plantation bank. The wealth generated by sugar and forced labor required sophisticated financial instruments to move across oceans and avoid the scrutiny of abolitionist movements in Europe. The Caribbean islands became the center of a complex credit network that linked London bankers to New World estates. This was capital in its most concentrated and most brutal form, seeking the highest return with the least interference. The plantation system relied on massive amounts of leveraged debt. Planters used their enslaved workers as collateral for loans, creating a financialized version of human suffering that was traded in the boardrooms of the Old World. These transactions were often shielded through offshore agents to hide the true extent of a family's involvement in the trade as moral tides began to turn. The islands provided the perfect opacity for these investments. This era solidified the Caribbean as a place where the ethical consequences of capital were divorced from its accumulation, a hallmark of modern tax havens. This plantation standard created a massive accumulation of wealth that stayed within the Caribbean's secret networks. When the British Empire finally abolished slavery, it paid out staggering sums in compensation, not to the enslaved, but to the owners. Much of this blood money was immediately reinvested into the same Caribbean financial structures that had protected the pirates a century earlier. The money didn't leave the islands, it simply changed its name. It moved into emerging industries like shipping and early insurance, further deepening the financial expertise of the region. This period proved that the offshore world was not just about hiding money from the government, but about hiding it from the conscience of the public. The Caribbean offered a space where the rules of the mainland did not apply, whether those rules were tax laws or moral mandates. The expertise in managing large, controversial flows of capital became the region's true specialty. As the sugar boom faded and the world moved toward industrialization, the Caribbean was ready to pivot once again. The pirate bank was about to go digital, but first, it would have to survive the total collapse of the old colonial order. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of managed decline for the Caribbean. As the old colonial empires began to retract, the islands faced a desperate economic crisis. The sugar industry was dying, and the plantation standard was no longer sustainable. However, the legacy of the pirate bank remained. The islands still possessed their most valuable asset, their legal status as dependencies with a high degree of autonomy. They were in the empire, but not of it. This unique constitutional status allowed them to begin experimenting with new ways to attract foreign capital. During this period, the first modern tax laws were being written in Europe and America to fund the growing welfare states and the machinery of modern war. As taxes rose in the metropole, the demand for offshore sanctuaries exploded. The Caribbean islands, looking for a new economic lifeline, began to offer themselves as low-tax alternatives. Bermuda and the Bahamas were among the first to realize that by keeping their taxes low, they could attract the headquarters of international companies and the personal fortunes of the global elite. The Pirate Cove was becoming the corporate office. This was the birth of the tax haven as we know it today. The islands didn't just ignore the laws of other nations. They specifically designed their own laws to attract those fleeing the laws of others. They offered incorporation, with zero disclosure and bank secrecy that was enshrined in statute. The expertise that had been honed by smugglers and plantation owners was now codified into the legal systems of the Bahamas, Bermuda, and eventually the Cayman Islands. They were creating a product, the offshore entity. The imperial sunset was not an end, but a rebranding. The Caribbean was moving from a region that produced physical commodities like sugar and rum to a region that produced financial services. The pirate bank was no longer about physical treasure, it was about the legal right to hide wealth. This shift was quiet, professional, and incredibly lucrative. As the world headed toward the chaos of the mid-20th century, the Caribbean was positioning itself as the ultimate safe harbor for a global elite that was increasingly fearful of the tax collector and the revolutionary. The mid-20th century, defined by the Cold War and the rise of the eurodollar market, catapulted the Caribbean into the stratosphere of global finance. The pirate bank had gone truly international. As the world split into two ideological camps, the Caribbean offered a third way, the neutral zone. It became a place where capital from any origin could be parked, protected from the political instability of the era. This was the age of the Cayman miracle, where a sleepy archipelago with more turtles than people transformed itself into the world's fifth largest financial center. The key to this transformation was the eurodollar, U.S. dollars held in banks outside the United States. To avoid American banking regulations and taxes, major London and New York banks began routing these dollars through their Caribbean branches. Nassau and Georgetown became the switchboards for the global economy. Every night, billions of dollars would flow through these islands in a digital dance that left no footprint. The expertise in regulatory arbitrage, the art of finding the gaps between different countries' laws, reached its zenith here. The Caribbean was no longer just a haven. It was the plumbing of the entire global financial system. This era also saw a darker side of the pirate bank return to the fore. The same secrecy that attracted legitimate banks also attracted organized crime and intelligence agencies. During the Cold War, the Caribbean became a playground for money laundering on an industrial scale. The CIA, the mafia, and various dictators used the island's secret accounts to fund covert operations and hide plundered wealth. The line between the clean money of the eurodollar market and the dirty money of the underworld became dangerously blurred. The Caribbean was the only place in the world where they could both sit in the same ledger, undisturbed. This period solidified the Caribbean's reputation as a place where questions are bad for business. The legal protections for secrecy were strengthened, and the culture of the islands became synonymous with financial discretion. The Cold War vault was more than just a place to hide money. It was a place that proved the global economy could not function without a dark space. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Caribbean stood at the center of the world's wealth, but a new threat was looming: the age of the digital leak and the global transparency movement. The tension was at an all-time high. The dawn of the internet age changed the pirate bank forever. No longer did you need to fly to Nassau with a briefcase. You could move $1 billion with a single keystroke. The Caribbean's financial centers became digital galleons, carrying vast quantities of data rather than silver. This increased efficiency also brought increased risk. The very technology that allowed for instant wealth transfer also allowed for instant exposure. The era of the mega leak, from the Panama Papers to the Paradise Papers, began to pull back the curtain on the Caribbean's secret world, revealing just how deep the pirate roots still ran. These leaks showed that the pirate bank was serving everyone from tech giants to world leaders. The scale of the offshore economy was revealed to be in the tens of trillions of dollars, a massive, untaxed parallel universe that drained the public coffers of the world's nations. The reaction from the global community was one of outrage. Pressure began to mount from the OECD and the G20 to shut down the tax havens. The Caribbean was accused of facilitating global inequality and enabling corruption. The digital galleon was under fire from a new kind of pirate, the whistleblower. However, the islands did not fold. Instead, they adapted once again. They began to implement surface-level transparency while maintaining the core of their secrecy through complex trust structures and shell companies. They learned to speak the language of international compliance while ensuring their clients remained protected. This was the ultimate evolution of the pirate bank, the ability to appear legitimate while remaining opaque. The Caribbean's legal experts became the world's best at creating legal labyrinths that could defeat even the most persistent investigators.